Hi guys, this is Weasel for PokerBrainiacs.com, and we are going to be discussing the concept of flop c-bets. So what is a c-bet? It stands for continuation bet, and it applies to any time a player makes the last aggressive action pre-flop and then fires a bet on the flop. So this includes open raising, 3-betting, 4-betting. Anytime a player takes the last aggressive action and then bets on the flop, it is referred to as a c-bet. If the player does not take the last aggressive action or is not the open raiser and is in fact a caller, it is not a continuation bet. If the caller is the player who then bets on the flop out of position, it is referred to as a donk bet and not a continuation bet. In general, people follow one of two types of c-betting strategies. Either they are a qualitative c-better, and that means that they wait for various hands before c-betting, so if they miss the flop they won't c-bet, but if they make a strong hand they will c-bet. And the other type is quantitative c-betters, and these are people that just fire a wide range of different flops, even if they don't hit the flop a lot of the time, and the reason they do it is because they expect to take the pot down on the flop often enough as a bluff. As for which one of these two strategies you follow, it is really up to you. It's maybe not the best idea to just pick a strategy and decide to follow that. If you want to really master which boards you are c-betting, etc., you need to make it villain specific. So against some players it might be a good idea to have a qualitative c-betting strategy where you only c-bet if you flop a strong hand, while against other players, perhaps ones that fold a lot to c-bets, you can perhaps take a more quantitative approach where you fire a wide range of flops even if you have not hit that flop, and only don't c-bet if you have a very specific reason. There are a number of factors involved in deciding whether you want to fire a c-bet or not, and we are going to consider a few of these. The first one, and perhaps the main one people immediately think about, is the flop texture. Certain flop textures are going to be better for firing continuation bets on than other flops. One of the most common types of flops that people claim are good for continuation bets are those flops known as BXX flops, and this stands for Broadway blank blanks. So here are some examples of some BXX flops. We have an Ace 7-2, very dry board, King 8-3, dry board, Ace 9-2, dry board. And these are considered good boards for a continuation bet, particularly as a bluff, because hopefully villain has not hit that board very often. There aren't many draws that villain can have hit, and hopefully you expect to get a decent amount of folds when villain hasn't hit the board very well. So traditionally the best boards to c-bet are dry boards, usually with one high card. Other types of boards that are typically good for a c-bet are paired boards. For example, we have the Queen 7-7 and the Ace 9-9. People don't necessarily like continuing on these boards because they are worried a lot of the time that you are going to fire 3 streets when you've made trips. Even though it's unlikely that you have in fact made trips, you still end up getting a lot of folds on these boards. Also, they are pretty dry boards, so it's also true that there aren't too many hands villain can have that he's that happy continuing with. There aren't many draws he can have. And even on a slightly drawier board, for example, we have this Queen 9-9, so there are some gut shots and there are some flush draws out there. Even these boards can sometimes be okay to c-bet because despite the fact that villain can have some draws, a lot of the time players will be worried about drawing to a hand that isn't the nuts, and pretty much any straight draw and flush draw villain can have on this board is not going to be a nut hand if he hits. And while villain is not necessarily going to be folding his strong draws, if he has a weak draw like a gut shot, etc., he may decide to let the hand go. Then we have some boards that are considered not that great to c-bet, and the reason being is because they are very coordinated and there are a lot of hands that villain can continue with, a lot of draws, a lot of pair hands and 2-pair hands. And some examples: the Jack of Hearts, 9 of Clubs, 10 of Hearts. So we can see that that's a very wet board. There is a flush draw out there. There are plenty of straight draws. Any queen or any 8 would give someone an open-ended draw. And so they are not necessarily the greatest boards to c-bet. Also, when you have 3 cards in close conjunction, there are hands like 10 Jack or 10 9 or Jack 9 which can have 2 pair, which people probably aren't going to be folding to 1-bet. In general, these are not good boards to c-bet as a bluff at any rate. It's going to be fine if you have equity, as we will go on to see. Another type of boards are low boards, and a lot of the time these aren't that great boards to c-bet. It really depends on what level villain's thinking on, and we will talk about that briefly. But a board like 6-3-3, there's no reason why you shouldn't c-bet a board like that. A lot of the time villain is not going to have hit that board. It really becomes a case of whether villain thinks you have hit that board a lot of the time. It seems a lot of players, even at the micro stakes, while they'll give you credit on an A7-2 dry board, they won't give you anywhere near as much credit on a 6-3-3 dry board. However, it is a dry board and there aren't that many combinations villain can have, so it's still going to be a good board to c-bet. The more coordinated low boards, typically you shouldn't c-bet them, because again there is more combinations of hands villain can have. But again, it really depends on what level villain is thinking on. If villain is the type who is just going to fold when he's missed that flop, they can become good boards to c-bet, even though typically they would be a bad board to c-bet because they are drawing. In general, if you just want to play a very ABC strategy, then you should probably not be c-betting the low boards, especially if they are coordinated. Another type of board is monotone boards, and ironically, although these boards are technically very drawy, they often end up being good boards to c-bet because people are folding a lot of hands if they don't have a 1-card flush draw, and they may even be folding some of their 1-card flush draws if they are not very high 1-card flush draws. For example, on the Ace of Hearts, 9 of Hearts, 4 of Hearts, if someone doesn't have a heart, perhaps a King of Hearts, they are probably going to be folding everything else. I think it's unlikely they're going to continue with a pair of 9s or a pair of 4s or some kind of pocket pair. Perhaps they'll continue with an ace some of the time. But on boards like the 10 of diamonds, 9 of diamonds, 8 of diamonds, you can perhaps expect people to be folding even some of their open-ended draws some of the time, perhaps some of their pairs. So, although you'd expect monotone boards to not be the greatest boards to c-bet because they are so drawy, if people don't like their draw, they are going to be folding a lot more often on these type of boards. And also in their mind, they may know that if they do have a 1-card flush draw, that their implied odds are not going to be as good because it's going to be pretty obvious when they hit their 1-card flush. And I go on to say that any of these boards can be good or bad c-betting boards depending on the levels involved. So if we take a BXX flop, for example, we've said that we think they're good boards to c-bet because they are dry, it's unlikely villains hit them, we can represent that one high card out there, and we expect villain to be folding a lot of the time. But what if villain is thinking on slightly the next level, and he thinks to himself, well, I know that this is a good board to c-bet, and I think this player is going to be c-betting the Ace-7 deuce board with 100% of his hands, including all the hands that haven't hit an ace and have nothing. If that's the case, a smart villain is going to give you less credit for c-betting an ace-high or king-high dry board because he knows that you are going to be c-betting that board extremely often, and as a result your fold equity on such boards goes down, and villain makes a play such as floating the flop and then bluffing you off your hand on the turn. So because villain is thinking on that level, a board which is typically or traditionally a good board to c-bet is going to become a not so good board to c-bet because you are not going to get much credit. Whereas on the other hand, if we take perhaps some more coordinated boards, perhaps we take this low coordinated board of 4 of diamonds, 3 of hearts, 2 of clubs, a lot of the time villain is not going to be expecting you to c-bet a hand like naked overcards like ace queen, ace king. So in actual fact, you may find you end up getting more credit for c-betting such a board against a good villain than you would against just a fish who is not going to fold anything that even has remote potential. Perhaps some fish may not even be folding overcards on such a board. So the point is that you can't necessarily objectively say this type of board is good for a c-bet or this type of board is bad for a c-bet. Dry boards are good for c-betting against players who are not going to play back if they haven't hit that board, because there's just simply less combinations of hands that they can have that want to continue. But they are not good boards to c-bet against regulars necessarily, because that regular is going to be playing back at a higher frequency. The same goes for mid-high coordinated boards. They're not typically good boards to c-bet, but they're not good boards to c-bet against a fish who is not folding any of his draws. Whereas against a regular, it might turn out to be a good board to c-bet because he doesn't necessarily expect you to be c-betting that type of board unless you have a hand. So there is a lot of leveling involved in deciding which flop textures you want to c-bet. Position is another element of when we want to c-bet. We want to c-bet more often in position, and there are two reasons for this. The first is that we will have more fold equity, and the reason we will have more fold equity is because if villain is conscious of the fact that he is out of position, he is perhaps aware that it is going to be difficult for him to play the hand. He also knows that if he takes a line such as check calling the flop, he has to fear that when he checks the turn that you are going to fire the turn as well. And by extension, if he check calls a turn, he then has to fear that you are going to fire the river when he checks the river to you. So basically, even if you never bet the turn, you c-bet the flop and you have the intention of never betting the turn, villain doesn't know that. As far as he's concerned, if he checks calls the flop, he has to face the possible threat of you betting the turn, even if you never actually bet the turn. So this invisible threat that's looming over villain means that you are going to have more fold equity. Also, you are going to have more information. Playing in position, you are going to see what villain does on the next street before you have to act, and from this you can gain information. So if villain then goes on to check the turn to you after you've c-bet the flop, you then get some information that villain didn't want to maybe donk bet the turn, and you can use the information, the extra information you gain, to make better decisions on later streets. So you should be c-betting more often in position than out of position. And the opposite things apply to c-betting out of position. You're going to have less fold equity and you are going to have less information to make good decisions on later streets. Now we are going to talk about villain, and some of villain tendencies have a very big influence on whether you decide to c-bet the flop or not. One thing we want to ask is, does villain fold a lot to c-bets or double barrels? And if villain folds a lot to c-bets, we may want to use a quantitative approach in c-betting villain. So we are going to c-bet a wide variety of flops just to exploit the fact that villain is folding a lot to c-bets. Whereas if villain is the type that doesn't like to fold a lot to c-bets, then we are perhaps going to take a more qualitative approach where we only c-bet if we have hit the flop in some way and we think maybe we have the best hand. Also to take into consideration is, does villain fold to double barrels? Because perhaps villain never folds to a c-bet, but villain folds if we fire a double barrel and he folds a huge amount to double barrels, in which case we can still c-bet some of the time with the intention of firing a second barrel. Another question is, does villain like to check raise as a bluff? Or does he like to check raise for value? Does he check raise ever? And there is often quite a lot of debate over the issue of what you do with a hand that has very weak showdown value, perhaps a mid pair, but is still likely ahead of villain's hand. Is that a hand you want to c-bet, or is it a hand that you want to check back for perhaps pot control? And the answer really depends on villain. If villain is the type of player that when he check raises, he is only going to check raise for value, then you might as well c-bet your mid pair, because when villain does check raise, it's pretty clear that villain has you beat and you can make an easy fold. If, however, villain likes to check raise as a bluff a large amount of the time, you may prefer to check back your marginal showdown, because you are not going to be that comfortable calling a check raise. You can of course take some advanced line if you think villain's check raising enough where you could bet very weak showdown and then call a check raise, but this is going to be high variance, and if possible you are going to want to avoid the situation. And if you think it's likely villain is going to check raise as a bluff a large proportion of the time, then sometimes checking back your weak showdown value may be a better option. Also, what level is villain thinking on? So we've discussed this briefly. Is villain a good regular who is going to expect you to c-bet an ace high dry board, for example, with your entire range? Or is villain a fish who is going to fold more often on an ace high dry board just because there's less combinations of hands that he has hit? And just as an example, if we take this board here, the ace 5 deuce dry board with no flush draw, it becomes less profitable against a regular, as we've said. And in actual fact, on this ace high dry board, it may even look stronger if we don't c-bet, because villain will be wondering why we didn't c-bet an ace high dry board, which most players are c-betting 100% of the time. Whereas, as discussed, c-betting a bad board in inverted commas, so a board that's traditionally a bad board to c-bet, for example 8 of hearts, 6 of hearts, 5 of diamonds, it perhaps looks stronger because villain doesn't expect you to be c-betting hands like ace queen with no flush draw, and so he gives you credit for having a slightly stronger range. Whereas against a fish, it might not be the best idea, because the fish is probably going to continue with any gut shot, any flush draw, perhaps even overs, any pair on such a board, and you are going to get called a large proportion of the time. It's also said that if you are the open raiser, and perhaps someone cold calls in the blinds, a board like 8 of hearts, 6 of hearts, 5 of diamonds hits the cold caller's range a lot more strongly than it does hero's range. And whether that's true or not does of course depend on the kind of range that villain is cold calling from the blinds, but against a lot of players it'll be the case that they don't expect you to necessarily be open raising hands that tangle with this board too well, whereas in their cold calling range villain can perhaps have all kinds of suited connectors and mid type hands, and maybe even some pocket pairs like pocket 8s, pocket 6s, pocket 5s. So in terms of ranges, villain's cold calling range is probably going to hit that board a little better than your open raising range. Equity. It's obviously fine to c-bet more often when you hit the flop. It may sound like a no-brainer, but we are saying that a board like Jack of Hearts, Nine of Clubs, 10 of Hearts is a bad board to c-bet in inverted commas. And the reason is because villain has a lot of hands that he can continue with. But we are talking primarily that it's a bad board to c-bet as a bluff. When we do have a hand that hits a board, for example, perhaps we have the Ace of Hearts and the 5 of Hearts on this Jack 9 10 board, so we have the nut flush draw, it's probably going to be alright to c-bet that board anyway. We build a pot for the times we do hit, and perhaps we'll have some opportunity to take villain off his hand on the later street. So when we say boards are good or bad boards to c-bet, a lot of the time we are referring to whether they are good or bad boards to bluff. When we do actually coincide with the board, we can obviously fire c-bet more often. Also, we want to c-bet more often as a bluff if villain's range is weak. So if we think the kind of range that villain is calling with does not hit the board very often, or villain looks weak, then we want to c-bet more often. Also, we can consider any future plans we have for the hand. So if we find ourselves in a situation where we think we can fire a second barrel profitably, then we can also c-bet more often. And there are two ways this can happen. Either villain just calls a lot of flops but folds a lot of second barrels, in which case he's a good target for a second barrel, or we find ourselves in a situation where we have some backdoor draws. So the classic example is perhaps we have a hand like ace-5 suited and of hearts, and there's one heart on the board, and we haven't actually hit the board, but it's a good board to c-bet perhaps, and we fire a c-bet because we are aware of the fact that if a heart peels off on the turn, that we can then fire a second barrel with additional equity. So not only do backdoor draws give you a small amount of additional equity in terms of absolute equity, but they can also give you quite a lot more equity in terms of fold equity when you can profitably barrel the turn with a much larger amount of pot equity, because your equity obviously improves quite dramatically when you do turn flush draw. So hopefully this has given you a brief idea of which hands to c-bet and which hands not to c-bet. The bottom line is there's no set answer. You should c-bet this board or you shouldn't c-bet that board. You have to take into consideration a whole number of factors, including what level is villain thinking on, what kind of pot equity do you have, what kind of fold equity do you have, are you in position or out of position, are you going to have good barreling opportunities on the turn. Therefore you pretty much have to make up your own c-betting strategy against each specific villain. But if you base your c-betting strategy on the things discussed in this video, then hopefully you will do quite well. So this has been Weasel for PokerBrainiacs.com. Thanks for watching.